So a third argument in opposition to humanitarian intervention would be that it can use, and this kind of follows on from what we were just saying, is that it can be used to justify wars of aggression. It can be used as a cover or fig leaf for wars of aggression, a cloak, if you like, for ulterior motives. Now, this is an argument made by realists, right? Remember, realists argue that all states act in their rational self-interest. This is what drives state behavior. And they never act out of altruism. So concepts like humanitarian intervention are kind of nonsensical for a realist, because states never act out of purely humanitarian objectives, concern for someone else. They always act according to what's in their own self-interest. And therefore, if we hear states talking about humanitarian intervention, for a realist, that's always going to be rhetoric to cover naked self-interest. But it's also, this argument is also made by Marxists, who argue that the advanced capitalist states tend to conduct wars to benefit their own capitalist class and not for, again, altruistic reasons. So again, if we look at examples, we can see how actually in each case of intervention, the interests of the intervening states have indeed been served by such interventions. So even Sierra Leone, which like Kosovo is often presented as kind of, and in contrast to Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, Sierra Leone is presented as this kind of case of a genuinely successful and altruistic intervention. Even in Sierra Leone, remember the British went in to prop up a government that it was allied with, and it was allied with in part for economic reasons. There are many British diamond companies with investments in Sierra Leone that were being threatened by the rebellion. So even there were ulterior motives at work. In Iraq, very clear that the intervention was aimed at preventing independent Arab control of the huge oil fields of Iraq. I think that's pretty clear. And in Libya, you could argue the same thing. Libya is a very oil-rich country as well. Gaddafi was an independent and arguably anti-Western leader. And the Western states involved didn't want such a figure in control of such large strategic resources. In Yugoslavia, there's an argument that the West were unhappy with Yugoslavia's resistance to the IMF, its refusal to privatize its economy. It was sticking to its socialist economy, and they wanted to open up the country to Western investment and exploitation. We can contrast these examples as well with the interventions that don't occur. So, for example, some people argue that the Palestinians should have some sort of international protection against Israeli aggression, or that the Yemenis should have some sort of protection against Saudi aggression. But in both these cases, interventions don't happen, arguably because to do so would be counter to the interests of the West, who support Israel, who support the Saudi aggression on Yemen, etc. And so if this is the case, if what's happening with humanitarian interventions is that really what's happening are wars of aggression that are being justified with humanitarian rhetoric as a cloak for ulterior motives, well, this is very dangerous. Wars of aggression, let's not forget, that is wars of choice, if you like, wars that are not in self-defense. They were described by the Nuremberg tribunals, the tribunal set up to try Nazis after the Second World War. A war of aggression was defined by Nuremberg as the supreme international crime, which embodies all the others. They argued that, okay, you can get these crimes in war crimes and genocide and massacres and rapes and so on, but all of these war crimes only exist because there's a war. So whoever brings about an unnecessary war, that is the ultimate crime. That is the basis for all of those other war crimes. So if humanitarian intervention is justifying the supreme international crime, which is a war of aggression, then that's a very dangerous thing indeed. So those would be the main criticisms of humanitarian intervention. But again, there are secondary criticisms that can be made, if you like, as well. So let's take this point that's used by supporters of intervention, that, well, we do now have, solid, universally accepted criteria for when intervention is justifiable, in the form of this responsibility to protect doctrine. Well, okay, you could argue that despite the ICISS's attempts to clarify the correct criteria for intervention, actually interventions still continue to be carried out when those criteria are not met. For example, in Libya, there was no large-scale loss of life or ethnic cleansing before the intervention. What NATO said was that there was a threat of this. But obviously, when you say there's a threat of something happening, that's completely subjective. It's speculation. No one knows what would have happened when the Libyan army retook Benghazi. I think, and many who've looked at this, as Alan Cooperman, agree, that what most likely would have happened in Benghazi is exactly what happened when the Libyan army retook all the other towns from rebel control, which is that there was fighting and people died on both armed sides, but there was no massacre of civilians. So really, it's remains still, despite these criteria, still very subjective if you're talking about what might happen, and it's just one person's word against another. A second additional criticism of humanitarian intervention is that although human rights are supposed to be universal, they're supposed to apply to all, with therefore all states presumably in theory subject to intervention if they abuse human rights or if they at least commit large-scale loss of life or ethnic cleansing. The truth is that in reality, it's only ever powerful states, militarily powerful states, the most militarily powerful states who can intervene against less powerful states. And therefore, effectively, states like the US, the UK, France, and their allies are basically invulnerable. However horrific their own abuses might be in places like Iran or Guantanamo, Iraq, or Guantanamo Bay, etc. No other country is in a position to intervene against them. So, and furthermore, if we take this point further, we can see, well, there's a real danger then that actually this impunity these states have is exacerbated by humanitarian intervention, because this intervention allows them to actually take out all their enemies who might one day prevent them from acting in the way they want under the guise of humanitarian intervention. So what I'm saying is that humanitarian intervention can only ever be carried out by powerful states against less powerful states, and therefore it perpetuates the inequality, the power inequality in the world, the North-South divide, if you like, that actually allows the northern states to abuse the rights of the southern states with impunity. A final point, interventions, and this is a direct counter to this argument liberals make about democracy promotion. Interventions often try to impose arguably unsuitable Western political structures. So, for example, if we have a look at what's happened in Iraq after 2003, you had multi-party parliamentary democracy imposed. And there's an argument that says imposing such a society on a society like Iraq that's arguably more tribal based tends to lead to one ethnic or religious group monopolizing power. So, for example, what's happened in Iraq is that the Shia majority have obviously dominated at the polls at election time. The Shia parties have more or less monopolized power. The Sunnis have felt alienated and excluded, which has formed the basis of the support base for ISIS. I'm not saying all the Sunnis of Iraq supported ISIS, far from it. But there was a certain degree of reluctance in Sunni areas like Mosul that ISIS took over to directly confront ISIS, because they were equally as scared of the Shia government that had been excluding them and so on up to that point anyway. So the argument is that this kind of multi-party democracy, where parties then just form along sectarian lines and the biggest group dominates and monopolizes power, this tends to fuel tension and conflict in the future and leads the way for future civil wars. It's exactly what's happened in Iraq with the rise of ISIS and so on. So, in conclusion, I would argue, whilst the theoretical and moral basis of humanitarian intervention is, of course, appealing, the reality of power and the power divisions in the world make it a very dangerous and generally harmful enterprise. It's difficult to dispute the moral principle that one should save lives and prevent massacres if one's able to do so, of course. But in the real world, the inequalities of military power means that it's generally only ever the US and its allies who have the means to intervene forcefully in others' affairs. And the consequences of them doing so have almost invariably been disastrous. One only has to look to compare the state of countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya before and after intervention for evidence. Humanitarian intervention helps perpetuate a world in which these wars of aggression can be carried out with impunity. And furthermore, it is these wars which are aimed at destroying the very states which might challenge the West's domination, which guarantee the West's continued impunity. And therefore, humanitarian intervention, by providing a moral fig leaf for these interventions, is generally disastrous and tends to lead to a worsening, not an improvement of human rights in the world. I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening.